Theon Greyjoy paced the length of the hall with restless energy thrumming through his limbs. He could feel the eyes of the Northmen upon him, though their gazes were not hostile. They were curious, perhaps suspicious, but they were not the open stares of strangers waiting for a turncoat to slip up. He was, after all, Theon Greyjoy, hostage, ward, brother in all but name to Robb Stark, and now envoy to Pike. Yet the memory of his father's harsh welcome lingered in his mind. When he had first returned home, Balon Greyjoy had assessed him with eyes of flint. The brief embrace had been cold. But Theon's thoughts could not rest on old wounds for long, because he was committed. He had bent his knee to Robb Stark for a purpose. This was a new age, and the Ironborn could not remain as they had been, scattered and scornful, raiders with no real place at the table of kings and lords, at least not in Theon's eyes. When Robb had chosen to send him, Theon had accepted the mission with pride, a determination to bring the Iron Islands into Robb's cause. He understood how vital the Ironborn fleet could be in the War of the Five Kings, and he refused to let old grudges stoke the fires of enmity. He remembered Eddard Stark's fair but stern kindness, and he remembered Robb's unwavering loyalty. If only, he thought, his father could see what a chance this was. The North had men, resources, vast lands, and a righteous cause. The Ironborn had ships, fearless captains, and a seafaring tradition that might break the Lannister supply lines or carve up the coasts at will. The combination, if it were to be realized, might shake the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. And Theon knew his father would only be swayed by strength and cunning. The first few days on Pike had been tense. Balon tested Theon's mettle, bombarding him with questions, insults, half-veiled threats. Yara, his sister, so changed from the girl he barely recalled, had watched him with a sardonic twist to her lips, as though she expected him to fail or fold at any moment. Yet Theon stood his ground. He laid out Robb's offer of alliance. The North recognized the Iron Islands' right to rule themselves, but they must join with the Starks against King Joffrey and the false authority of King's Landing. They would divide Lannister spoils if they succeeded. Perhaps they might look to retake the Shield Islands or carve out other territories in the west. It was a bold plan, one that appealed to Balon's yearning for independence, for the freedom he had craved in days when he had styled himself King of the Isles. After long deliberations, Balon rose from his seat, iron in every line of his spine. In that dimly lit hall, he locked eyes with Theon. There was anger in them, a sense of betrayal that Theon had grown up among the wolves. But there was also a flicker of respect. Balon commanded Theon to swear an oath on the old way of the Ironborn to prove his loyalty to Salt and Rock. Theon knelt, biting back the flood of memories that reminded him how far he had come since leaving Pike as a boy. If he lied, or if he hesitated, Balon would see through it. Theon kept his voice steady, swore that the Ironborn would find in him a true son of the Iron Islands, one who would help them rise in power and show Westeros their might. In that moment, Balon accepted. A hush fell over the hall as the Ironborn chieftains and captains realized they would ally with the king in the north. The old men remembered Eddard Stark's crushing victory years ago but said nothing, and the younger men murmured among themselves about the plunder and glory that might be won. Theon felt sweat bead on his brow. He was forging a new destiny. No longer would he walk the knife's edge between friend and foe. He would bring the Ironborn into a shared cause, standing shoulder to shoulder with Robb Stark, the man he called brother. Under the bleak gray sky, Theon soon departed Pike with a small Ironborn retinue, his sister included, and orders to relay Balon's final decision to Robb. The journey north by sea was rough, the storm-lashed waves a fitting prelude to the unpredictability of war. As the ship approached the stony coasts of the north, Theon felt something loosening in his chest, a breath of relief. He had done it. He would keep his word. He would not betray Robb. Robb Stark received them in Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that barred passage into the north. Theon disembarked, trudged up the muddy pathways, and found Robb waiting with gray wind at his side. The direwolf's yellow eyes flicked warily over the Ironborn. Yet Robb allowed them entry, for Theon's message carried weight. Once inside the old moss-covered walls, Theon delivered the news. Balon Greyjoy would join the Stark cause. Robb did not hide his surprise, but he clasped Theon's hand in a warm greeting. Their fates were now tangled, forged into a single weapon aimed at the heart of the Iron Throne. Word spread quickly through the north. Lords and bannermen who had once spat curses at the Ironborn for their raids and brutalities found themselves forced by necessity to entertain the idea of an alliance. Many were uneasy, especially those with coastal holdings that had been sacked in days gone by. Roose Bolton observed from the shadows, his pale eyes giving nothing away. The Karstarks frowned and whispered among themselves. The Manderleys of White Harbor, longtime guardians of the North's main port, viewed the alliance with peculiar caution. But for every doubt, there was a tempered realization that they needed ships, and the Ironborn had no equal on the seas. Theon visited each great hall in turn at Robb's side, stifling resentment under a veneer of courtesy and offering restitution, courtesy, new routes of trade. He reminded them all that there was a greater war to fight, and old enmities would have to wait. The largest shift in sentiment began when Yara Greyjoy took the measure of her newfound northern allies. Where once she might have come bearing a raider's cunning, she found that the Northmen's sense of honor had value. She sat at feasts next to the Umbers, who told raucous war stories about the battles they had waged during King Robert's rebellion. She took the measure of Lord Wyman Manderley, who politely but firmly questioned her about how the Ironborn planned to protect his ships in the narrow seas if they joined forces. Yara responded with a confident grin that once the Iron Fleet set sail, no Lannister or Tyrell vessel would make it past them. The North needed their salt-born cunning. The Ironborn wanted their chance at glory and retribution against those who had long scorned them. The newly forged alliance was put to the test sooner than expected. Robb's scouts brought news that Roose Bolton's forces, stationed in the south of the Neck, had encountered Lannister outriders near the region known as the Green Fork. If Tywin Lannister was beginning to send scouts that far north, it meant he was testing the front lines for weaknesses. Everyone knew the Lannisters held the advantage in gold and knights, but if the Ironborn could strike at Lannister supply lines by sea, it might force Tywin to split his forces. Robb wasted no time. He called a war council in Moat Caelin's largest tower, where the old stone walls loomed and wind howled through cracks in the battlements. Great John Umber, Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, and Meege Mormont were among those in attendance. Theon stood near Robb's right hand, flanked by Yara. A map of the Seven Kingdoms lay stretched across a long oak table. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the parchment. Robb spoke firmly, voice carrying the ring of command that belied his youth. He proposed a two-pronged attack. The main northern host, fortified by allied riverlords under the command of Edmure Tully, would move along the Green Fork to meet any Lannister thrust coming from Harrenhal or the Golden Road from Lannisport. Meanwhile, the Ironborn fleet, with smaller detachments of northern longships, would raid the coasts from the Westerlands up to the Cape of Eagles, disrupting trade and preventing the Lannisters from sending their armies swiftly by sea. If Cersei or Tywin attempted to move troops around the southern coasts, they would think twice with Ironborn ships waiting to pounce. The Ironborn captains, including Dagmar Cleftjaw and a few of Balon's more seasoned men, studied the map with keen interest. Dagmar pointed to Fair Isle and the smaller port towns along the Westerlands coast, describing how quick strikes could be made. If the Lannisters were forced to protect those coasts, they would stretch themselves dangerously thin. The plan was audacious. Theon could see the flicker of excitement in the eyes of the Ironborn. They wanted to raid, to show their might, but this time they would do it under the banner of King Robb Stark, forging respect instead of just fear. The alliance was sealed with an exchange of gifts, symbolic but meaningful. Robb presented Yara with a fine steel sword wrought by Mikken of Winterfell. The blade was simple in design, lacking the ostentatious gems or gold filigree favored by southern lords, but it was strong, flexible, and supremely sharp. Yara accepted it with a nod, acknowledging the earnestness of the gift. In return, Dagmar offered Robb a carven figure of a kraken, shaped from driftwood polished until it gleamed black like coal. It was an old family heirloom rumored to have been carved centuries past. Robb accepted it, and the gesture held the promise of a new bond. Their course was set. Within a fortnight, the host marched south, standard-bearers holding aloft the dire wolf of House Stark. Interspersed among them were men from the Iron Islands, though fewer in number, for many had remained with the fleet. Yet it was a remarkable sight to see the seahorse sigils of some Ironborn captains riding alongside the Stark banners. The black kraken of House Greyjoy flapping near the proud white direwolf. Soldiers from lesser houses mingled, eyeing each other uncertainly at first, but the stubborn sense of northern loyalty and the Ironborn thirst for valor slowly bridged the gap. Tent by tent, campfire by campfire, men laughed over shared rations and boasted of battles won. They were forging a brotherhood in adversity, for the Lannisters stood poised to crush them if they faltered. As the days of marching wore on, Theon found himself walking near Robb more often than not. At night, over sparse meals in the command tent, they reminisced about their boyhood hunts in the forests near Winterfell, how Theon had teased Robb for missing a shot at a sprinting stag, how Robb had once saved Theon from a boar that had turned on him. The tales became a balm, reminding them both of a simpler past. They avoided talk of betrayal or doubt. Theon was thankful for that. He could feel the unspoken tension in his chest, the fear that some might still question his loyalty. But he clung to the knowledge that he had refused to turn on Robb. He had done the right thing. In time, their host reached the Riverlands, a land ravaged by war. Smoke rose from distant farms, and the once tranquil waterways were murky with silt and debris from burned villages. Small folk trudged along the roads, hoping to escape the chaos. In the distance, the looming, twisted towers of Harrenhal reared like a warning of the brutality that had befallen the realm. There, Tywin Lannister's forces had garrisoned for a while, but word came that they had marched west, perhaps anticipating Robb's arrival. Under Edmure Tully's guidance, the northern host crossed the Red Fork near Riverrun, where Catelyn Stark greeted them with a mixture of relief and concern. She looked upon Theon with guarded eyes but did not openly scorn him, instead choosing to trust her son's judgment. The arrival of the Ironborn was met with hushed whispers from the Tully bannermen. But necessity overrode old grudges. Soon enough, discussions turned to strategy. Robb decided to strike swiftly at the Lannister forces near the tumbling ruins of Ashmark, a lesser holdfast that commanded part of the Westerlands' approach. If they could gain a foothold there, they could hamper movement between the Westerlands and the Riverlands. Meanwhile, Yara would sail with most of the Iron Fleet around the coast and land raiding parties along the rocky shores of the Westerlands, drawing Lannister troops away from the interior. It was a dangerous plan that relied on precise timing. If Robb's attack stalled or Yara's raids lost momentum, Tywin could regroup and crush them piecemeal. Theon was entrusted with overseeing communications between the land forces and the fleet. He took pride in the task. Every raven that soared away from the northern camps, every coded message that traveled with swift riders, bore the weight of the alliance. Theon felt the tension building in his chest again. Every day brought fresh challenges. Horses died in the mud, outriders brought conflicting reports of enemy positions, and the Riverlords who had once been battered by the Lannisters worried that the combined strength of the North and Iron Islands might still be insufficient against the gold and might of House Lannister. Yet the tide began to turn when Yara's longships arrived near Case, a port town under the banner of the Lannisters. With cunning, she led a small night raid on the harbor, setting fire to 2 Lannister ships and capturing a handful of merchant vessels loaded with supplies. Town bells rang frantically in the darkness, and the defenders scrambled to mount a response. But Yara and her Ironborn slipped back to the waiting longships. Within hours, they vanished into the open sea, leaving the port reeling. From there, the Iron Fleet harried Lannisport-bound ships. Merchant captains, worried about losing their cargo, began diverting routes, slowing the flow of supplies to the Lannisters. Meanwhile, Dagmar Cleftjaw and others launched quick assaults on coastal keeps that lacked strong garrisons. They reaved and collected spoils, but this time, at Theon's instruction, they spared the lives of small folk who surrendered, taking only what was necessary for the war effort. It wasn't mercy in the purest sense, but it was far different from the old days of wanton slaughter. As these raids continued, Robb capitalized by striking at Lannister forces moving east. Theon accompanied Robb's vanguard, witnessing firsthand the brutal reality of open battle. Knights in gold and red clashed with men wearing the direwolf crest on their surcoats. Swords rang, arrows whistled, and the muddy fields were churned into a quagmire of blood and grime. Theon fought side by side with men of the north, proving himself on the battlefield. He was no commander of thousands, but a single well-placed arrow from his bow could unhorse a charging knight or silence a Lannister crossbowman. After one particularly savage fight, Theon knelt in the mud, panting, his arm shaking from loosing so many arrows. He looked up to see Robb, spattered with dirt and gore, but victorious. The sense of camaraderie surged in Theon's chest. These were the men who had become his family in all but name. The victory at Ashmark was not total, but it was enough to force the Lannisters to retreat. Edmure Tully's forces advanced to reinforce Robb, and together they built makeshift fortifications along the approach. For days, ravens flew back and forth between Robb and Yara, each message describing successes or warning of Lannister movements. Theon was in the thick of it, transcribing messages, occasionally adding his own suggestions. When news came that the Lannisters were sending a fleet from King's Landing in a desperate attempt to counter the Ironborn presence at sea, Theon could not help but grin. He imagined the frustration on Cersei's face, forced to muster royal galleys. He knew the Ironborn would relish meeting them on the water. At Harrenhal, Tywin Lannister seethed, or so the reports said. Reinforcements from the Reach were uncertain, for the Tyrells might have been swayed by other matters. Renly Baratheon's death had thrown some confusion into the southern alliances. Stannis Baratheon loomed at Dragonstone with his own designs on the Iron Throne. And somewhere in the chaos, a boy king named Joffrey sat on the Red Keep's throne, oblivious to the real cost of war. The realm was cracking, and the North and Iron Islands were hammering at one of the largest fault lines. Catelyn Stark traveled between the northern camps and Riverrun, doing her best to maintain alliances. She faced lords who questioned the wisdom of trusting Ironborn raiders, yet she counseled patience and unity. If their fight against the Lannisters faltered, it would not matter whether old grudges lingered. The Lannisters would exact revenge on them all. Slowly, grudgingly, even those most skeptical like the Freys seemed to accept the new reality. Walder Frey, ever a man to sniff out advantage, began to speak more politely of Theon, for the alliance with the Ironborn strengthened Robb's position, and Walder was loath to oppose a rising power. Months passed, battles ebbed and flowed, and winter's chill crept into the nights. Theon accompanied Robb through all of it, forging a bond that transcended mere strategy. They became as close as they had been in youth, though now they were tempered by the horrors of war. One cold night, after a skirmish that ended in a Lannister retreat, Theon stood outside Robb's tent, gazing at the stars. He remembered a similar sky over Pike, how the sea breeze had whipped through his hair. He felt torn between two worlds. Yet for once he did not feel alone. When dawn broke, a raven arrived bearing urgent word from the Ironborn. A royal fleet under the banner of King Joffrey had engaged them off the coast near Banefort. Yara reported victory, though it was hard-fought. Several Ironborn longships had been lost, and the fighting had been fierce. She also noted that she had taken a key prisoner, Ser Imry Florent, a commander of the royal fleet. Rumor had it that Florent was in service to King's Landing. Capturing him might yield valuable information about the Lannisters' seaborne capabilities. Yara wrote that she would sail around the Westerlands once more, then possibly make for Pike or Sea Dragon Point to repair damages. Robb wasted no time in calling together his advisors. They discussed the next phase of their campaign. The initial plan of dividing the Lannister forces seemed to be working, but Tywin was not defeated. He had consolidated a strong army around Harrenhal and the gold mines of the Westerlands. Eventually, they would need to confront him in a decisive battle. While some northern lords yearned to march on King's Landing, others argued that the seat of Lannister power was Casterly Rock, and if they could take it, the Lannisters might truly break. Theon found himself leaning toward the latter idea. That ancient fortress on a rocky promontory had never fallen to an invading force. But if the Iron Fleet blockaded the sea access, and Robb's armies marched from the landward side, perhaps it could be starved into submission. At first, the plan sounded mad. attack the seat of Lannister power. But as they hashed out the details, it began to take shape. If the Ironborn continued their raids on the coast, forcing the Lannisters to defend multiple points, Casterly Rock itself might be vulnerable. It would require cunning and precise coordination. Yara would need to sever supply lines from the ocean, while Robb's host engaged the Lannister forces in the field, preventing them from reinforcing the rock. The Riverlands lords, still bitter over the countless atrocities inflicted by the Lannisters, agreed with grim determination. Even Roose Bolton, who preferred subtlety and cruelty to open warfare, saw the strategic value. Capturing Casterly Rock would be the blow that changed the course of the war. Their armies began to move westward. Theon was sent ahead with a detachment of cavalry to scout the passes through the Westerlands. The rolling hills grew rockier, dotted with mines that once poured gold into Lannister coffers. Some had been abandoned, and in a few outlying hamlets, the small folk offered little resistance, half-starved and frightened. Theon pitied them, remembering the fear in the eyes of Pike's smallfolk when Balon had once led an ill-fated rebellion. War consumed everyone, highborn and low alike. On the march, Theon found himself forging bonds with northern lords he once barely spoke to. The Karstarks, still grieving the loss of their kin at the hands of Jaime Lannister, shared stories by the campfire. One young Karstark told Theon how his cousin had been slain at the Whispering Wood. Theon listened, offering quiet condolences. Lord Rickard Karstark, grim-faced as ever, simply nodded at Theon from time to time, as if acknowledging that Theon had proven himself worthy. Even Great Jon Umber, ever boisterous, bellowed that if Theon Greyjoy fought as fiercely as the rumors said, then he'd happily fight alongside him. Still, it was not all camaraderie. There were whispers. Some lords muttered that Theon's presence was a trick, that the Ironborn would betray them at the worst moment. Theon tried to ignore the rumors, focusing on his duties, which grew heavier each day. Word arrived that the Lannisters had mustered a force near Craighall, possibly to attempt a relief or to intercept the Northmen before they reached Casterly Rock. Robb changed course, wanting to avoid a direct confrontation if possible, or at least to choose the battlefield. This meant sending out smaller groups to raid, distract, and mislead the enemy. Theon volunteered for one such mission. Robb hesitated but ultimately agreed, trusting Theon to keep their foes off balance. Leading a mix of Ironborn Reavers and Northern Scouts, Theon set out under cover of night. Their goal was to feint at Craighall, drawing out the defenders and hopefully spurring Tywin's men to believe the main force was near. Riding through the darkness, Theon felt a spark of pride. He commanded men from both worlds now, and though their temperaments clashed, they followed him because he had earned respect in battle. The mission went well at first. They set small fires, clashed with outlying patrols, and created enough chaos that a large portion of the Lannister detachment hurried toward Craighall. Then, slipping away before dawn, Theon's force vanished into the hills. But the next day, as they moved to regroup with Robb, they were ambushed. Hidden in the thick forests near a winding river, a Lannister cavalry unit waited. Suddenly, horns sounded, and the flash of gold and red banners appeared among the trees. Theon cursed, calling for his men to form ranks. The Ironborn readied axes and spears, the Northerners nocked arrows. The battle was a brutal melee in the cramped confines of the forest. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the crack of steel on steel echoed among the trunks. Theon loosed arrow after arrow, then drew his sword when the fighting closed in. He saw the glint of a lion's sigil on a charging knight and barely sidestepped the lance. Theon drove his blade into the horse's flank, toppling the rider. In the chaos, Theon nearly lost sight of his men. Branches whipped his face. The stench of blood choked the air. An Ironborn warrior collapsed beside him, a spear through his chest. Theon bellowed at the Northerners to rally around the banner, a hastily stitched patch of wolf and kraken that they used to identify themselves. They fought back, slaying Lannister soldiers who had pinned them in. Eventually, the Lannisters realized they could not wipe out Theon's force quickly, and with the approach of northern reinforcements signaled by horns in the distance, the ambushers withdrew. The forest fell silent except for the moans of the dying. Theon's arm shook with the aftershock of close combat. Around him lay the bodies of both Northern and Ironborn men, along with Lannisters. He felt a pang of guilt and anger. Would it ever end? The violence weighed on him more heavily than he cared to admit. But he had survived, and so had most of his force. They regrouped, tended their wounded, and set out for the agreed rendezvous. By the time they rejoined Robb, the king in the north looked relieved but troubled by their losses. Yet every skirmish, every sacrifice, edged the Lannisters further into a corner. With coastal raids ramping up again, courtesy of Yara and Dagmar, Tywin was forced to dispatch men to protect Lannisport and the smaller coastal towns. He could not risk losing Casterly Rock's supply lines entirely. That split in his forces gave Robb the chance he needed. Moving swiftly along lesser-known trails, guided by local scouts loyal to the Tullus, Robb's main host approached Casterly Rock from the north, where the terrain was rough and less guarded. Nightfall cloaked the army as they took up positions on a ridge overlooking the rock's formidable walls. Lanterns below flickered, revealing glimpses of towers that jutted out from the ancient fortress. The sea crashed against the cliffs, and in that darkness, Theon could just make out the faint shapes of Ironborn ships blocking the harbor. If they could hold this siege long enough, starvation would grip the fortress. But laying siege to Casterly Rock was no small feat. Lannister arrogance was built, quite literally, into those high stone walls. Robb's war council decided on a bold approach. They would attempt to lure out the Lannister defenders, forcing them into open battle. If Cersei or Tywin had stationed enough men inside the rock, they might believe they could break the siege with a sortie. Meanwhile, Theon's sister would continue to harass any ships trying to bring provisions. Theon offered a suggestion, recalling something he had once heard while in Winterfell. Miners and smugglers in the Westerlands knew of secret tunnels near the coast, entrances to the natural caverns beneath the rock. If they could find one unguarded route, a small strike force might break inside. Days turned into a tense standoff. The Northmen built crude fortifications, dug trenches, and set up watchtowers on the surrounding cliffs. From within the rock's walls, archers fired down at them if they came too close. Several times, a wave of Lannister soldiers emerged in an attempt to disrupt construction or burn siege equipment, but the Northmen and Ironborn fought them off. Each clash was fierce, and though the defenders retreated behind their walls, casualties on both sides mounted. Supplies began to run low, not just within Casterly Rock but in the besieging army as well. Theon saw worry lines deepen on Robb's young face. They needed a swift victory, or else winter's approach would see them starve as well. Refugees streamed out of the countryside, further complicating matters. Theon did what he could, but the crisis worsened daily. The Ironborn also sent word that storms at sea threatened their blockade. The seas in autumn grew unpredictable, and Lannister blockade runners might slip through. At last, an opportunity arose. A handful of Ironborn scouts had captured a local fisher who claimed knowledge of a hidden sea cave that opened into the underground passages below the rock. The fisher had been sneaking in eels to the fortress for a small fortune. Theon interrogated him, using a mix of persuasion and the looming threat of Ironborn interrogation methods. Under pressure, the fisher agreed to guide them, under the condition that his family would be spared. Theon, hardened by war but unwilling to inflict cruelty without cause, gave his word. That night, Theon led a small force, gray wind bounding silently in their midst, down the rocky slopes to a hidden cove. Yara had contributed a few seasoned Ironborn swimmers and climbers for the infiltration. They moved silently, hugging the cliff face as waves crashed at their feet. It took them hours to find the exact spot, a narrow opening masked by seaweed and jagged rocks. One by one, they slipped inside, water swirling around their ankles. Torches were lit only once they were far from the entrance, revealing a dripping cavern that rose and fell in twisting tunnels. The smell of sea rot and brine was overwhelming. Guided by the fisher, they navigated deeper, occasionally hearing echoes of footsteps above. The fisher swore there were iron gates deeper in, but also that the Lannisters might not guard them heavily, trusting in the fortress's reputation. Eventually, they reached a small iron portcullis that blocked the path. By torchlight, Theon and two Ironborn pried it open. The screech of metal sounded thunderous in the cavern, and they held their breath, waiting for a patrol to rush down. But none came. They continued up a sloping passage until the cavern walls gave way to a rough stone corridor. This was no longer a natural formation. It was part of Casterly Rock's labyrinthine underworks. Darkness pressed in on them, and the flicker of torchlight made shadows dance on damp walls. At a fork, the fissure hesitated, pointing left, then right, trying to recall the path to the storerooms. Theon bit down on his impatience, mindful that any wrong turn could lead to discovery or a dead end. Finally, the fissure chose a route that led them upward. They emerged in a large cellar, stacked with crates of grain and barrels of salted fish. The stench was nearly unbearable, a mix of rotten food and mildew. Through a half-rotted wooden door, they glimpsed the corridor that led deeper into the fortress. The group fanned out, knives drawn, mindful that a single cry of alarm could ruin everything. They crept through the stone halls, passing a few guards who were easily subdued in silence. Theon's heart hammered in his chest. Every step brought them closer to capturing the fortress from within or to disaster. At last, they reached a small guard station that overlooked one of the main gates from the inside. If they could open that gate, the besieging forces outside could rush in. Theon gave the signal. Grey wind lunged at the nearest guard, jaws clamping on the man's throat before he could scream. An Ironborn reaver slit the throat of another guard from behind. A third guard tried to run, but Robb's voice echoed in the chamber, "Stop him!" And an arrow from one of the northern archers ended it. With the guard station secured, Theon and Robb hurried to the gate mechanism. It was a heavy, winch-operated contraption. Together with a few men, they strained at the winch, the chains rattling and groaning. Theon felt sweat drip down his forehead, arms burning. Slowly, inch by inch, the heavy portcullis rose. Outside, the night air bristled with tension. At first, no one noticed, but then horns sounded in the darkness. Theon prayed that it was his men, not the enemy. Moments later, figures with a direwolf standard and the Black Kraken rushed forward, streaming through the half-lifted gate, dispatching the astonished Lannister guards inside the courtyard. Chaos erupted within Casterly Rock's walls. Fires flickered as the invaders spread, seizing towers and corridors. Theon led a detachment toward the central keep, where the Lannister command might be. Shouts and clangs of steel echoed off the stone. Lannister knights, hastily roused from sleep, scrambled to form a defense. The courtyard filled with the scent of blood, smoke, and terror. For every Lannister who fell, a Northman or Ironborn also paid a price. But the element of surprise weighed heavily in Robb's favor. Soon, the main Lannister host, scattered between the fortress interior and the camps outside, realized they were under attack from within and from all sides. Some tried to flee by smaller gates, only to find Ironborn waiting. Others barricaded themselves in lesser towers, hoping to hold out. Yet the besiegers pressed the advantage. Theon fought through corridors lined with crimson tapestries bearing the lion's sigil. He saw paintings of Lannister ancestors watch impassively as the fortress was taken. He couldn't help but marvel at the wealth displayed, tapestries spun with gold thread. This was what the Ironborn had always coveted, but now it served as a symbol of what they could achieve with the North. At last, the fighting dwindled. Robb and his men secured the main halls, and Yara's forces locked down the seaward defenses. Victory was at hand. Theon found himself standing in the grand hall of Casterly Rock, where a massive golden lion statue loomed over them. Fires and braziers cast dancing shadows across the polished floor. Bodies of knights, guards, and some of Robb's men lay scattered. Robb Stark stood tall, gray wind at his side, surveying the scene with quiet astonishment. They had done what no one had done before, taken Casterly Rock by force. Not all the Lannisters were present. Tywin, they learned, had left days prior with a large contingent, possibly to respond to a rumored threat in the Reach or near King's Landing. Ser Kevin Lannister was rumored to be in the castle, but in the frenzy, he could not be immediately found. Many lesser members of the family cowered in hidden chambers. Theon oversaw the rounding up of any defenders who laid down their arms. The cost in blood had been high, but the fortress was theirs. For the first time in generations, the North and the Iron Islands held the seat of Lannister power. Theon felt a strange mixture of triumph and heaviness. Had they truly won, or had they simply opened the door to a new wave of horrors? War was not so easily ended, but the banners of the dire wolf and kraken flew high above the battlements, visible to any who still resisted. A hush fell over the fortress as dawn's first light revealed the truth. Casterly Rock was no longer a Lannister stronghold. Robb announced a halt to further killing. He wanted the fortress secured, prisoners held, and the people spared if they submitted. Theon watched as soldiers carried out the wounded, including some Lannister men. The harsh reality of war demanded cruelty at times, but mercy could also be a weapon. If the small folk within the rock saw that the Starks and Ironborn did not butcher wantonly, they might cooperate. Many would resent the invaders, but Theon hoped at least some would see a chance for peace. Throughout the castle, the Northern and Ironborn soldiers looted, but under stern orders not to burn or destroy the wealth recklessly. Yara took a band of reavers down to inspect the Lannister docks. She reported that a few ships had fled during the confusion, but the majority were seized or sunk. The rest of the Iron Fleet patrolled the waters, ensuring none of the garrison could escape by sea. Meanwhile, Robb's bannermen explored the luxurious chambers, marveling at the opulent furnishings, golden candelabras, and rich tapestries. Theon could see hunger in some eyes. Even the proud Northmen who prided themselves on their hard land and simpler tastes were not immune to the allure of Lannister riches. But Robb had no intention of letting greed tear apart the alliance or the realm. On the second day of occupation, Theon joined Robb on the battlements. The wind buffeted them, carrying the salt tang of the sea. Below, the sprawl of Lannisport stretched, quiet under the watchful eye of the Ironborn blockade. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, but the usual bustle had quieted to a fearful hush. Robb's gaze was distant, thoughtful. He asked Theon if he ever imagined they would stand here, side by side, with the castle of the Lannisters beneath their feet. Theon shook his head, recalling how he used to jest about the arrogance of House Lannister, how they claimed they were as strong as the rock itself. And yet, here they were, with the dire wolf and the kraken flying overhead. News of their victory raced across the Seven Kingdoms. Theon imagined the shock in King's Landing, the fury of Cersei Lannister, the dismay of Tywin once he learned what had happened. He felt satisfaction, but also a pang of apprehension. When lions were cornered, they lashed out. This war was far from over. The realm was fractured by multiple claimants to the throne. Renly Baratheon was dead, Stannis lurked in the east, Joffrey sat precariously in the capital, and now the king in the north had struck a catastrophic blow against House Lannister. Balon Greyjoy, too, would undoubtedly demand recognition for his role in this victory. The cracks in the alliance might grow if not carefully managed. Over the following weeks, Robb established a semblance of governance in the Westerlands. He appointed castellan duties to one of the more reasonable riverlords, Lord Vance, to oversee daily affairs while the army moved on. But the Ironborn staked their own claim, stationing men at the docks and controlling maritime trade. Some friction erupted between northern soldiers and Ironborn reavers over spoils. Theon found himself playing mediator, reminding both sides that the true enemy remained the Lannisters. He brokered deals for splitting goods, and in some cases returning items to smallfolk if they were vital for survival. These negotiations wore on him, yet he believed it was the only way to preserve unity. Amid the chaos of occupation, a curious discovery was made. Deep in the vaults, northern soldiers came upon old records and scrolls detailing trade agreements, genealogies, and letters from Lannister lords. Robb saw little use for them in the short term, but Theon recalled that knowledge could be a powerful bargaining chip. Perhaps they contained secrets that could sway lesser Westerlands houses to switch allegiances or undermine Lannister claims. Theon set them aside for safekeeping. Simultaneously, envoys arrived from the Reach, from Dorne, and even from the Vale, each uncertain how to treat this sudden shift in power. Some congratulated Robb, others offered thinly veiled threats. The North's victory had upset the delicate balance of the war. The Iron Throne might attempt to muster new allies. Theon could not help but recall the old adage, "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." He was in the game deeper than ever before. One evening, a small band of surviving Lannister loyalists attempted to retake the fortress, sneaking through side passages in hopes of assassinating Robb. Theon, by chance, was patrolling that wing of the castle with a few Ironborn. They intercepted the would-be attackers in a corridor lined with statues of proud Lannister forebears. The fight was swift and bloody. Theon's sword sang as he crossed blades with a scarred knight in battered Lannister plate. Sparks flew, and Theon narrowly avoided a thrust to his ribs. He responded with a slash that cut through the knight's visor, sending him reeling. Another loyalist rushed him from the side, but Theon ducked low, driving his blade into the attacker's belly. In the end, the loyalists lay dead or dying, and Theon stumbled away with a shallow cut across his arm. That night, Robb thanked him personally, though Theon shrugged off the praise. He only did what needed doing. Still, a sense of acceptance washed over him. Whatever else he was, Greyjoy or Stark, he had proven his worth. Yet it was a precarious triumph. The war raged on outside Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister was no fool. If he could not reclaim his seat soon, he would at least make the North and Ironborn pay dearly. Scouts reported that Tywin's army had regrouped near Ashmark, pulling bannermen from the depleted countryside, mustering a force that could still rival Robb's. With winter looming, provisions were scarce. If Tywin launched a sustained campaign to retake the Rock, the Northmen might be trapped in a siege of their own. Robb convened a high council in the Rock's Great Hall. Theon stood at his side, along with Yara and several trusted lords, Galbart Glover, Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, Edmure Tully, and others. They debated their next move. Some wanted to hold the Rock at all costs, believing it the key to toppling House Lannister entirely. Others argued they should gather all the spoils they could, then retreat to the Riverlands or the north, leaving the fortress in ruins. Yara insisted that the Ironborn could hold the coastal areas if Robb insisted on a strategic withdrawal, but that would leave them vulnerable if Tywin came in force. In the midst of this debate, a messenger arrived from the north with dire news. Winterfell had been attacked, not by Lannister forces, but by remnants of House Bolton, or so the rumors said, aided by a band of opportunistic mercenaries. Roose Bolton, standing in the council, insisted he knew nothing of any such plan. He was here, after all, with a large part of his levy, but suspicion filled the hall. If Bolton men had broken away to seize the seat of House Stark, it hinted at treachery. Another messenger claimed Ramsay Snow, Roose's bastard, had been sighted near Winterfell. Robb demanded answers, but Roose offered only cold shrugs and claims of ignorance. Theon felt his blood run cold. If Winterfell was in danger, how could Robb remain in the Westerlands? The seat of House Stark was unprotected, a symbol of northern pride. If it fell, the morale of the entire north might crumble. The fortress was never truly designed to withstand a massive southern invasion, but this threat was from within the north itself. The alliance with the Ironborn might become strained, for the Greyjoys had no love for Winterfell. Yet Theon's loyalty to Robb burned bright, and he declared that he would sail north at once to defend Winterfell if needed. Robb faced a choice. Should he abandon his hard-won prize in the Westerlands to save his home? Or should he remain and solidify his power, trusting his remaining bannermen in the north to repel the traitors? Catelyn Stark's pleas eventually swayed him. She sent urgent messages, insisting that the heart of their kingdom was threatened. If Robb let Winterfell fall, his claim to be king in the north might ring hollow. Theon could see the pain in Robb's eyes. Leaving the Rock now might squander this incredible strategic advantage. But letting Winterfell burn was unthinkable. In the end, Robb chose his family's ancestral seat over the prize of conquest. He named Lord Vance Castellan of Casterly Rock, with a small garrison of trusted Northmen and Ironborn to hold it. He urged them to hold fast if Tywin came, or retreat if it became impossible to defend. The main host would march back to the north, hopefully reaching Moat Cailin before winter storms made travel unbearable. Yara debated whether to remain in the Westerlands, continuing raids, or return with Robb to strengthen the Ironborn position. Balon Greyjoy's instructions had been to disrupt Lannister power, but he had not foreseen an assault on Winterfell from other northern forces. In the end, Yara chose to split her fleet. Half would remain to maintain pressure on the Lannisters' western coast, while the other half, led by Theon, would sail with Robb to White Harbor, then move north by land to Winterfell. It was a frantic effort. Theon oversaw the loading of supplies, weapons, and wounded men onto the ships. The battered northern host boarded vessels and set sail along the coast, guided by Ironborn navigators. Winter storms loomed, but they were desperate to reach home in time. During the voyage, Theon wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was returning to Winterfell, his childhood home, the place he had once nearly betrayed. On the other hand, he was returning as a friend, an ally, determined to protect it from traitors. The sea journey was rough, and men crowded together below decks, seasick or wounded. They prayed the old gods or the drowned god for safe passage. Finally, they reached White Harbor, the port city of House Manderly. The sight of its looming walls and harbor was a relief. Wyman Manderly greeted them with as much hospitality as circumstances allowed, though he was distraught at news of potential chaos in the north. He pledged his knights and vessels to Robb without hesitation. From White Harbor they pushed north. Winter's bite was evident now. Snow dusted the hills, and freezing winds howled. Some nights, men huddled in their cloaks around fires, sharing meager rations. Theon rode at the head of a contingent of Ironborn cavalry and northern outriders, scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. At last, scouts brought word. Winterfell had indeed been attacked and partially burned. The traitors had occupied it for a time, but a band of loyal Stark men, backed by local lords, had driven them out. The seat of House Stark was in dire need of repairs, and the morale of the surrounding regions was shattered by the betrayal. Ramsay Snow was rumored to have fled into the countryside, leaving chaos in his wake. Robb's company arrived at Winterfell under gray, snow-laden skies. Theon's heart twisted at the sight of the scorched walls, the battered gates, the shell of the great hall that had once been alive with warmth and laughter. The castle stables were partially collapsed, and the smell of charred wood and death clung to the air. Yet Winterfell stood, if only barely. The small folk who had survived gathered in the courtyard to greet their king, relief and weariness in their eyes. Robb dismounted, stroking gray wind's fur. Grief etched into his features as he surveyed the damage. Theon stood beside him, remembering the boy he had once been here, practicing archery in the courtyard with Robb and Jon Snow, teasing Bran, flaunting his cocky smile. Now he felt only sorrow for what had befallen this place. He stepped forward, addressing the people in a firm voice, promising that they had not been abandoned, that the Starks and their Ironborn allies were here to protect them. The reaction was mixed. Some still saw the Ironborn as raiders, untrustworthy. But Theon pressed on. Actions would matter more than words now. As repairs began, Theon took charge of reorganizing the castle's defenses. He had learned more than a few lessons from the siege of Casterly Rock. He directed men to clear rubble, rebuild the gates, and secure the walls. A portion of the Ironborn set to work with surprisingly skilled hands, for building was not so different from repairing ships. Theon personally led a search of the surrounding woods and abandoned farmsteads to root out any lingering traitors. They found a few Bolton men, ragged and half-frozen, and swiftly apprehended them. Ramsay Snow himself was nowhere to be found, a phantom lurking in the winter gloom. Robb, however, had more pressing worries than just Winterfell's reconstruction. The realm was still in the grip of war. They held Casterly Rock tenuously, but Tywin Lannister was undoubtedly on the move. Stannis Baratheon remained in the east, threatening King's Landing or perhaps the Reach. The Ironborn, stretched between multiple fronts, risked fracturing their alliance if Balon grew impatient. And the north faced its own winter. If the harvests were insufficient, starvation loomed. Desperate discussions took place in Winterfell's half-rebuilt Great Hall. Lords Serwyn, Hornwood, and Manderley offered what little grain and manpower they could spare. Theon suggested calling more Ironborn ships north to carry supplies from friendlier southern ports, but that posed a risk if the Lannisters intercepted them. Meanwhile, whispers rose of dark omens beyond the wall, rumors of undead wights and white walkers. Most lords dismissed these as wildling tales, but some, especially those from the Shadow Tower, insisted something terrible was stirring in the far north. Through it all, Theon stood at Robb's side, unwavering. He made his rounds across the broken battlements and soot-stained corridors, ensuring that both Northmen and Ironborn stayed alert and disciplined. Over time, he noticed a shift in how the people looked at him. The glances were no longer just suspicion or fear. There was, in some eyes, a flicker of respect or gratitude. Winterfell might never forget that the Ironborn had once raided their shores, but they would also remember who came to help rebuild. Theon felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of acceptance. When the snows deepened and travel became treacherous, Robb decided to keep the bulk of his forces in Winterfell and its environs, fortifying the seat of House Stark. Scouts still traveled south, carrying messages to and from Casterly Rock, the Riverlands, and the Iron Islands. News arrived that Tywin had made a counterattack at the Rock, forcing Lord Vance and the garrison to withdraw to the lower fortress. Yara's portion of the Iron Fleet had been forced to sail away due to storms, giving the Lannisters a chance to bring supplies in by sea. Even so, the damage to Lannister prestige and resources was done, and they would not soon recover from such a blow. The War of the Five Kings was far from over, but House Stark and House Greyjoy had stamped their mark on its bloody pages. In the cold quiet of Winterfell's Godswood, where the ancient weirwood stood silent under layers of hoarfrost, Theon often found himself reflecting on the path he had taken. He would kneel by the black pool, gazing at the red leaves overhead, hearing only the faint rustle of wind. He recalled his father's harsh words, the sense of alienation he felt in both Pike and Winterfell. Yet now, he was forging a new identity, a Greyjoy of the North, a bridge between two worlds once locked in hatred. He thought of the times he had doubted whether this was possible. But the battered castle around him was proof that alliances could be made anew, that you could step off a chosen path and find another. He remembered the day he had decided not to betray Robb. He could still see the candlelight flickering across Robb's hopeful face in that war council, the sense of trust and friendship that had survived years of separation and suspicion. Perhaps that single choice had changed the course of history. If he had turned on Robb, taken Winterfell in a misguided attempt to earn Balon's respect, the North might have been permanently splintered. Now, instead, they stood as an unlikely partnership that had humbled the Lannisters and held strong despite the trials of war. Robb joined him in the Godswood one evening, a rare respite from the burdens of command. They spoke quietly, voices muffled by the snow. Robb thanked Theon for his loyalty, for standing by him when so many others would have faltered. Theon replied that he owed Robb just as much. Their bond was complicated, forged in brotherhood and tested by time and blood. But it endured. As the moon rose above the weirwood branches, Theon told Robb that he did not know what the future held. The war might drag on for years, armies would march, and new kings might rise and fall. But he believed that this alliance between the North and the Iron Islands could reshape the realm if they held true to it. Robb nodded, silent for a moment, then spoke of a dream he had. A united North, from the White Knife to the Iron Islands, free of southern meddling, strong and just. He said that if men like Theon Greyjoy and men like Lord Manderley could find common ground, anything was possible. They parted ways, each returning to the duties that awaited. Winter wore on. Supplies dwindled, but they did not starve. The Ironborn ships that sailed in from time to time brought fish, grains from sympathetic Riverland houses, and occasionally southern wine that brightened a dreary feast. Scattered skirmishes with Bolton loyalists and bandits kept the men on edge, but Winterfell remained secure. In the darkest months, men huddled in the hall by the warmth of fire, telling tales of their conquests in the Westerlands or their exploits on the sea. Theon was often at the center, regaling them with stories of how they climbed the hidden tunnels beneath the rock. Northmen and Ironborn would roar with laughter or pound the tables in approval. In the spring, when the snows melted and the roads cleared, scouts brought word of fresh developments in the southern theaters of war. King's Landing was rife with instability. Stannis Baratheon had been repelled at the Blackwater but was gathering strength again. House Tyrell had thrown in their lot with King Joffrey, strengthening the Lannister grip on the capital, but the blow to Casterly Rock still stung. The crown's coffers were not as deep as before, and Tywin could not march north as easily. Meanwhile, rumors of Daenerys Targaryen in the Far East began to surface. The realm was truly in flux. Robb conferred with his mother and advisors. Theon was a key voice in these discussions. They debated whether to renew the campaign in the Riverlands and press their advantage while the Lannisters struggled to recover. If they could cement their position, they might negotiate a peace that recognized Northern and Ironborn independence. Some lords argued for total victory, march on King's Landing and depose the Boy King. Others counseled caution, citing the toll already taken on the North's population. In the end, Robb decided on a measured approach. He would secure the North's borders, aid the Riverlands in driving out any remaining Lannister presence, and hold Casterly Rock from afar if possible. If Tywin came in force, they would weigh their options then. From Pike, Balon Greyjoy sent ravens demanding to know why they had not sacked more coastal towns, why the Ironborn had not claimed more spoils. Theon read these letters with a weary scowl. Balon, proud and stubborn, saw the war primarily as a means to elevate himself to true kingship of the Iron Islands. Theon drafted careful responses, explaining the strategic necessity of holding off on further raiding, especially if they meant to keep the North's trust. Yara, more pragmatic, managed to soothe her father's anger, reminding him that they had achieved what no Ironborn had done in living memory. They had seized and briefly held Casterly Rock. That alone would echo through the sagas of the Iron Islands. In early summer, the North prepared for another march, this time south to relieve Riverrun, which remained under threat from small Lannister raiding parties. Theon helped coordinate the mustering of men, bridging the gap between the Ironborn forces and the Stark bannermen. Though tensions still existed, the alliance had forged an unexpected cohesion. Now, men who once cursed each other's names joked about how their combined strength had humbled the Lions of Lannister. Before the host departed, Theon found himself standing atop Winterfell's walls, gazing out over the surrounding countryside. He remembered how he had once nearly succumbed to ambition, how he had been tempted to take this castle by stealth. The memory of it still brought shame. Now, the burned timbers and scorched stones of Winterfell were a testament to the cost of betrayal. He reminded himself of the path he had chosen, the path he would continue to choose. As the army set out, banners snapping in the wind, Theon rode near the front, Robb Stark at his side. Grey Wind loped alongside them, ears pricked, golden eyes scanning for threats. Behind them, columns of Northmen stretched, a patchwork of sigils. The flayed man of Bolton, the sunburst of Karstark, the bear of Mormont, the trout of Tully, and interspersed among them, the black kraken of House Greyjoy, a sight that would have been unthinkable not so long ago. Together they advanced, determined to protect the realm they carved out for themselves. Theon could not say how the war would end or if they would ever see lasting peace. Perhaps the Iron Throne would broker a truce, or perhaps more bloodshed lay ahead. But he knew that if they stood united, the North and the Iron Islands might rewrite the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. He looked at Robb, the young king who had risked everything for his people, and felt a rush of fierce pride. No matter what songs the bards might compose in years to come, Theon Greyjoy would have a place in them, not as a betrayer, but as a brother to the king in the North and a champion of the alliance that defied ancient hatreds. Thus they rode on into the uncertain horizon, forging a new legacy with every step of their march, the wind carrying the echo of war horns across the open fields. And somewhere far away, storms brewed at sea, dragons were whispered of across the narrow sea, and the machinations of kings and queens turned ever on. But for this moment, the wolves and the kraken strode side by side, and the promise of a free north guided them toward whatever lay ahead. a testament to the choice Theon had made. Never to betray his brother, and to bind the Iron Islands and the North in a bond of blood and steel that might withstand the trials of the darkest nights to come.